Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're wrestling with a question that, it goes right to the heart of how we even define knowledge.
Right.
What actually makes something science? Is it the prestige, the fancy journal it's published in?
Or is it something more fundamental? Is it about the method itself? Is it reliable? Is it transparent?
Exactly. Venue versus function. And that's our focus for this deep dive. We're looking at the work of Marge Blanc and her natural language acquisition framework, or NLA.
But we're looking at it through a really unusual lens. We're setting aside the academic debates for a moment and applying the rigorous, almost unforgiving standards of forensic science.
The big question being, does NLA hold up? Can it meet that highest possible bar for evidence?
I love this way of framing it. It just cuts through all the noise. We're not just talking developmental theory. We're asking, what would stand up in a court of law?
And the source material gives us this incredibly potent definition of a scientific workflow, and it comes straight out of forensic practice.
What does it say?
It says it's a reliably repeatable pattern of activity enabled by a systematic organization of resources that can be documented and learned.
And what's so powerful about that definition is that it's purely functional. It's not about who gave you permission. It's about whether the thing actually works.
Right. It suggests that scientific validity isn't something that's given to you by an institution. It has to be earned by the method's performance.
Did it work for Blanc? Can you, as a listener, pick it up and get the same results? That's the test.
Okay, so before we jump into the pillars of that definition, let's just quickly set the stage on NLA for anyone who's new to this.
Good idea.
So Blanc's work is all about kids who are Gestalt language processors. The core idea is that they don't learn language one word at a time.
No, they start bigger. They grab whole chunks of language, entire phrases or scripts, what she calls gestalts.
And then over time, they start to break those down, they mitigate them, and eventually they arrive at self-generated analytic language.
Exactly. So the big question becomes, was her mapping of that process just a clever insight, a kind of clinical art?
Or was it a verifiable scientific method?
And that takes us to those 5 pillars of integrity. The source argues her work satisfies every single one.
Okay, let's walk through them. Pillar A is reliability.
Reliability, which really just means it's a pattern that keeps showing up again and again, no matter how you slice the data. It refuses to disappear.
And with Blanc, we're talking about a serious amount of data.
Oh, yeah. 15 years. Meticulously observing and documenting 85 children, and she saw the same arc every time.
All phrase gestalts.
Then partial echoes or mitigations.
And then finally, new self-generated sentences.
That was her initial data set. But here's where the reliability part gets really interesting.
This is the surprising part.
Clinicians all over the world, people who had never met her, never read her initial data, working in different countries, different languages, they started describing the exact same progression.
Wow. So it wasn't just her. The pattern held across totally different observers.
For 2 decades. That's reliability. Which leads right into the next pillar. Pillar B, repeatability.
The pattern that holds when other people try it.
I love the distinction the source makes here. If a method only works for its creator, it's art. It's a brilliant recipe, maybe, but it's not scalable.
But if it works for the world,
then it's science.
And NLA seems to fall squarely into that science category. We see it being replicated everywhere.
Everywhere. Early intervention programs, school-based therapy, in homes with multiple languages, even with autistic adults reclaiming their language. The method just, it works.
So if it's reliable and repeatable, that must mean it's well organized. Pillar C, systematic organization.
Right. This isn't just about intuition. Blanc's clinic had a very clear structure. There were protocols for transcription, for instance.
And crucially, the methods were relational, right? They were all about foregrounding emotional safety and attunement with the child.
Yes, and that's not a soft skill. That's part of the systematic organization. That relational safety is what provided the clarity for the linguistic data to even emerge cleanly. It ensured you were seeing real development, not just compliance.
Which brings us to Pillar D, documentation. The old saying, if it's not documented, it didn't happen.
Well, she documented it. First, there was the 4-part series in the Autism Asperger's Digest back in 2005. That was the first longitudinal study.
And then the big one, the 2012 book, Natural Language Acquisition on the Autism Spectrum.
The Big Brown Book, as everyone calls it.
And what's key here is her choice of venue. She didn't lock it away in some obscure academic journal.
No, she wrote for parents, for clinicians, for educators. She made sure the knowledge got into the hands of the people who could actually use it instead of letting it die in an ivory tower.
Okay, so that leads to the final pillar, e-learnability.
The method the world could actually pick up and run with. The NLA framework spread because it worked. It spread through word of mouth and visible success, not some big marketing budget.
Hundreds of thousands of people learned it, applied it, and proved it was teachable.
Which establishes a genuine scientific lineage carried forward by the practitioners themselves.
When you lay it all out like that, pillar by pillar, the methodology feels incredibly solid.
It is. But let's push it even further. Let's take it to the ultimate test. Section 2, the forensic frame.
This is where we apply the standards of the legal system, things like the Delbert Standard, and specifically Rule 702.
Right, because in a courtroom, nobody cares where your paper was published. They care if your method is sound. And Rule 702 is the gatekeeper for expert testimony in the U.S.
It's basically a three-part checklist to see if your science is good enough for a court of law. So let's run NLA through it. Requirement number 1. Is the testimony based on sufficient facts or data?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, 15 years of longitudinal data on 85 children. I mean, you compare that to some high-prestige academic studies with tiny artificial sample sizes.
There's no comparison. The depth of the data is huge.
It's richer and far more detailed.
Okay, so passes number 1. Requirement 2. Is the testimony the product of reliable principles and methods?
It is. And what's important to understand is that Blanc's work didn't come out of a vacuum. It's a continuation of an existing scientific lineage.
It builds on older research.
Exactly. Researchers like Ann Peters in the 70s and Barry Present in the 80s were already talking about formulaic language. Blanc just followed that thread with incredible clinical detail and confirmed the full sequence. The foundation was already there.
So the principles are sound. Final requirement number 3. Has the expert reliably applied the principles and methods to the facts of the case? Or, for NLA, has it been reliably applied in the real world?
Unquestionably. Thousands of practitioners internationally across cultures and languages are all reporting the same predictable stages. The method works when you apply it with fidelity. That's the ultimate proof of reliable application.
The contrast here is what's so striking. NLA sails through this legal standard. But the source makes a pretty bold claim that a lot of the more established behaviorist literature...
It would fail.
It would fail this test.
It would struggle, certainly. A lot of that literature defines success as compliance, not as spontaneous, authentic communication. A judge applying Rule 702 would ask for proof of self-generated language.
Not just prompt dependence.
Exactly. They would demand proof of ecological validity. Does this work in the messiness of the real world?
Yeah.
NLA has that proof in spades.
We should also mention the critiques, like the recent Hutchins 2024 work. The source positions these not as empirical challenges, but as conceptual ones.
Correct. They're challenges to the terminology or to the epistemology, how we categorize the knowledge. But you can't just wish away 2 decades of global, replicated, functional evidence by arguing about what to call it. The data is what it is.
Which leads us perfectly into the final section, the politics of gatekeeping. If the science is so solid, why was it ignored by the academic mainstream for so long?
Well, because it was never really about the evidence. It was about the venue and maybe the ethics.
What do you mean?
The work showed up in a magazine for parents. It was written in accessible language, and it centered things like relationship and emotional safety. The source argues that to the traditional academy, that proximity to care can feel like contamination. They prefer the clean distance of a lab.
So that's where this concept of gray literature comes from.
Yes, it's a label, but it's not just a descriptive label. It's used as a tool to quarantine knowledge, to build an epistemic quarantine.
So if it wasn't published in the right place, you can just dismiss it without engaging with the ideas.
Precisely. It's a system that preserves the hierarchy by conflating institutional authority with actual truth.
But hold on, isn't peer review important for a reason? I mean, wasn't the Academy just following its own standards by being skeptical of something published in a digest?
That's a fair point, but the rigor was in the work itself. Blanc published the full methodology, the longitudinal data, openly. It met the forensic standard. What the Academy rejected wasn't the rigor. It was the venue, and more importantly, the paradigm.
Let's talk about that. The paradigm threat.
It's huge, because if NLA is right, if Gestalt processing is a natural developmental path, then it fundamentally undermines the conventional behavioral model.
The threat is epistemic. It's not personal.
Exactly. It means that for decades, many remediation systems were operating on a fundamentally incorrect model of how these children's minds work. The idea that the child is already logical, just processing language differently.
It makes the old model of correcting and building language from the outside obsolete. It completely flips the script.
And the most profound insight didn't come from a big university lab. It came from a small relationship-based clinic.
This is where the source says we see the rise of practitioner science.
Yes, the traditional community of peers wouldn't review the work, so a new community of peers emerged.
The global network of families and clinicians who actually use the method.
And replicated its results. They created what the source calls a counter-archive.
Not a library of papers, but a living repository of knowledge built through real-world experience, through care, through seeing it work day after day.
And that counter-archive is arguably more ecologically valid than any lab study could ever be. It proved itself in real life.
The irony is just. It's profound. The knowledge that the Academy labeled as marginal turns out to be where the functional truth was living all along.
So, to bring this all together, the science is already home. It wasn't waiting for a stamp of approval. The workflow itself is the proof.
And the global replication by parents and clinicians, that's the real peer review.
Published is published. When a method is documented with care, shared openly, and then replicated around the world, it doesn't need an institution's blessing to be true. It already is.
The truth wasn't something we had to build. It was something we had to learn to see, to recognize the logic that was already there in the child.
And ultimately, this whole discussion about NLA forces us to reevaluate what we prioritize as evidence. Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener.
If methodological integrity and reproducible evidence are what truly matter,
Then what specific existing practices in education or therapy today, practices that lean heavily on traditional academic validation and journal prestige, what practices would actually fail if we held them to the rigorous real-world cross-examination standards of the legal system, like Rule 702? Something to think about.